don't know me, and welcome to our Friday report out. It's half term this week. There are lots of people on holiday, so I think we've got a small but perfectly formed audience. But I think our viewership online has been going up over time, so who knows. Hello to everybody who's listening online. So we've got two report outs today. We've got ophthalmology giving an update, their 30-day report out, and Victoria's here to do that. And then we've also got a report out from Sarah Mackey, one of our rheumatologists, and she's going to talk about a care pathway for suspected giant cell arteritis. So we'll save questions for the end, and we'll hear our two report outs first. So Victoria, can we come and ask you to come and give us your progress report? Thank you.
How do I?
Click there. Or you can use the brackets. That's easier.
Just open it on there.
Yeah.
Okay. It's still not doing it. Oh. Hello, my name's Vicky and I'm the process owner for RPIW6 and I'm one of the senior sisters in ophthalmology. Our RPIW was based around eye casualty. Within eye casualty, we get patients referred to us from a number of areas, including PCAL, A&E, minor injuries, GPs, opticians, and from medics from the wards. Eye casualty is an unpredictable environment, and we can never clearly know how many patients we will have in a clinic session and their reasons for the referral and their treatment needs. So we were given a challenge to reduce the length of stay for patients within the eye casualty department to 1 hour and 15 minutes, and for patients to have first contact with a healthcare professional within 15 minutes of their allocated arrival time. As you can see from the lead time, patients were spending an average of 2 hours 43 minutes in eye casualty, but since we started the work from the RPIW, this has reduced to 1 hour and 20 minutes. Previously, only 22% of patients were seen within 15 minutes of their arrival time, and this has now been increased to 50%. And this is just a copy of the value stream map that we did as well. So we introduced triage slips which get attached to the patient's notes, and every morning the most senior clinician for the eye casualty will triage the referrals that we have and make a plan for the patients, which includes if they want the patient's eyes dilating and what tests they want the patients to have. This means they can all be completed before the doctor does their assessment with the patient, whereas before sometimes the doctor would be seeing the patient after the nurse had triaged him, and then they would be going for scans and then seeing the doctor again. And these photos just show the journey before and after that the patient takes through the department, some before and after triaging. We've started an equipment hub as well, so in every room there's equipment that they're going to need for every patient, but sometimes there's equipment they need for some patients but not all, so we've centralised it and put it on an equipment hub so they know where to go and find it, and reducing interruptions and time away from patients. We've changed the room setup slightly and we've added more drops and equipment in, and we've put photos on the wall in the room so it's a visual aid so staff know quickly what is needed when they're setting up in the morning. So the list there of all the interruptions from an observation that we did from when the doctors, just for the doctors. So we do have a senior help needed board, so if you're needing help in clinic you can go and write your name and room number on the board. Then as more senior clinicians are finishing with their patients they can see who needs help, so it's to prevent interruptions while staff are with patients. However though, this isn't being used properly at the moment and staff are reluctant to use it, so going forward I'm going to try and understand why it's not being used to try and change things so that it can be implemented. So this is a copy of the production board that I've been using since the RPIW week. The orange shows the areas that are in progress and the pink are the areas to start, and I use this as a guide and pick one square at a time to use as a focus. I've discussed the RPIW work we have done in audit day in the nursing meetings. An email's been sent out to the medical team to ensure they are aware of the changes, and it's mentioned in the morning huddle as well. The barriers I've come across is that when a child inpatient or a transport patient comes into eye casualty, they take priority over people that are already there, so potentially we may not get the recordings that we want for the timings. Consistency as well, so after we did the RPIW week, some of the doctors left and we got new doctors, so after I'd started telling everyone, I've had to go back and start again. And I just found for the key learning, it's consistency, to just mention the same thing every day, and it seems to be working at the minute. Next steps, I'm going to focus on the interruption sides within clinic, mainly the needing help and escalating help board. I'm going to continue to work on the timings of when the patient first has contact with a healthcare professional, and I'm going to continue to develop and modify the standard work and continue to embed the changes within eye casualty.
Thanks, Vicky. I was giving you your Sunday name, wasn't I? Introducing you. I was here when you were reporting out from the RPIW, as I'm sure many others were, and I can see that you've done a huge amount of work since then. And that challenge of doctors changing over is one that I think lots of people are experiencing. So I'm sure there'll be questions for you and comments after. Sarah, please can I invite you up and ask you to give your report out about the care pathway for suspected giant cell arteritis.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Sarah Mackey. I'm a rheumatologist from Chapel Allerton Hospital down the road, and I would like to tell you a little bit about our improvement project about giant cell arteritis diagnosis. So actually there's a typo on this slide. We started in October 2018. This is a little bit of, this has been a little bit of time in the making. And I've got quite a big team member, and this is just some of the people who have been working with me on this. So giant cell arteritis is a medical emergency. It's an inflammation of the blood vessels supplying the parts of the head and the neck and some other parts of the body, and if it's not treated promptly with high-dose steroids, it can cause blindness or stroke. So it's very important to get patients treated fast and also diagnosed accurately. The difficulty is that it can be quite difficult to diagnose. We need to book some special tests, and all of this can take a bit of time. So this is the pathway that we've had for a few years now in Leeds. If a giant cell arteritis is suspected, then we encourage doctors to start steroids if it's strongly suspected and refer urgently to a specialist team, which is either rheumatology or ophthalmology. We then see the patient, and that's done by a registrar in rheumatology. And if we think it's a strong enough suspicion of giant cell arteritis, we continue steroids and we book specialist tests, which is temporal artery biopsy or ultrasound of the temporal artery, and we book them for follow-up. And then they're seen in a consultant clinic, the diagnosis is confirmed or refuted. If it's confirmed, they continue steroids. If it's refuted, then we stop their steroids because they don't have the disease we're treating them for. So the problem that we identified was that patients, all this took time, so most patients who go through the pathway actually don't have giant cell arteritis. So they're being treated with high-dose steroids for a disease that they don't actually have. So this wait from presentation to that final diagnostic decision could be split into three main subsets, which so the first component of that delay is the delay from starting steroid to temporal artery biopsy, which was the main test at this time that we were using for diagnosis. Then there was a further delay from doing the temporal artery biopsy to that being reported by our pathology department. And then there was a further delay once those reports were available until the patient was then seen in clinic. And so our primary driver, what we wanted to reduce, was this overall time from starting steroids to having that diagnostic confirmation. So in the meantime, we were working on treatment guidelines, British clinical practice guidelines for giant cell arteritis, diagnosis and management, and those have actually just been published last month in collaboration with a lot of other rheumatologists and ophthalmologists from the UK and around the world. And in these guidelines, we synthesised the evidence for temporal artery ultrasound as another diagnostic test that could be used in addition to or instead of temporal artery biopsy. So the temporal artery ultrasound can show the what we call a halo, which is a area of reduced echogenicity around the temporal artery. We can also image the axillary arteries, the arteries in the armpits, which can show similar changes. And of course, the advantage of ultrasound over biopsy is it's faster, it's cheaper, it's non-invasive, it's much more acceptable to the patients, and this had the potential to really cut into our waiting times for our patients in our pathway. So from January 2019, we introduced temporal artery ultrasound as a pilot, really, and we decided that we were going to use lean tools to identify how this whole pathway could be improved. So not just introducing a test, but looking at the pathway as a whole and looking to see what happened in terms of patient outcomes. And before we started to introduce ultrasound, we did a value stream map to start to look at improvements that could be made within what we were doing already, as well as this new thing. And we set targets within 5 domains, guided by KPO, of delivery, quality, service, morale, and cost. So delivery was our lead time, and this was our time from entering the pathway through to having that diagnostic decision. And the green arrow shows you where we introduced ultrasound at January 2019. And up till then, the blue line is our lead time, and that was relatively constant at around a month, 28 days. And then following introduction of ultrasound, we've been able to reduce that lead time. I would say that we didn't switch over from biopsy to ultrasound. We introduced ultrasound alongside temporal artery biopsy. So the orange line is the wait for the biopsy, the grey line is the wait for the biopsy report, and the light blue line at the bottom is the wait that patients had to have ultrasound. And we didn't want to just ditch biopsy, because actually in many patients both tests are useful. And also, because it was early days, we needed, as a group of clinicians, to have confidence in this new test. So we advise doctors, do an ultrasound as well, but please don't forget to do a biopsy. And then we've spent this year comparing the answers from the biopsy and the ultrasound as well. So our lead time has improved, and the ultrasound is done an average of 2.5 days from the referral through to the pathway. So it's not done on the same day, but it's done quite fast. In terms of quality, we thought quite hard about relevant clinical outcomes, and there's 2 groups of patients. There's the patients who don't have giant cell arteritis and the patients who do have giant cell arteritis. And so we split our patients into these 2 groups. So in those that don't have giant cell arteritis, we thought the most important thing was how much total dose of prednisolone they took over this time until it was finally stopped. So before January 2019, patients took an average 1.34 grams of prednisolone over this pathway. These were the patients that did not have the disease. Since January 2019, because we've been able to improve our lead time, we've reduced the average prednisolone dose to 0.85 grams. So that's still quite a lot, but it's better than it was. In terms of the patients that do have giant cell arteritis, what we thought was the most important thing was that they had a test which confirmed that diagnosis. And that's important both because it gives us clinical confidence that we're treating the right disease, but it's also important because biologic therapies have now been licensed for giant cell arteritis, and there's quite a strict process for getting those patients approved for that biologic therapy, and it helps a lot if they have a positive temporal artery biopsy or a positive ultrasound. So before January 2019, only 29% of patients who were treated long-term for giant cell arteritis actually had a positive test result. Part of this is because temporal artery biopsy is notorious for producing false negatives, and so even if the test was negative, often we would go on and treat the patient anyway if we had clinical concern. But the ultrasound adds extra diagnostic value, and since January 2019, 69% on average of patients with giant cell arteritis, treated with giant cell arteritis, have had a positive test result to back that up. So we think that that's quite an important improvement. In terms of morale, we sought informal staff feedback, and it was generally good, but actually introducing an extra test introduced greater medical complexity. So what do you do when the answers conflict? And there were some admin glitches to work through, and this is actually what we're trying to optimise that now. And patient questionnaires, we gave some patient questionnaires to patients going through the new bit of the pathway, and that all gave very positive feedback. in terms of costs, because of this new faster pathway, perhaps, and the general raising of awareness of giant cell arteritis around these guidelines, more patients have been referred to our pathway since the introduction of ultrasound. So we've been doing more ultrasounds, but actually we've been doing fewer biopsies on average per patient. The total number of biopsies per month is about the same. And because on average each patient is less likely to have a biopsy and more likely to have an ultrasound, on a per patient basis, the average costs of tests is reduced, although there are more patients going through the pathway, so that balances out. So next step, so our lead time has reduced over 2019 without really reducing the number of biopsies, but we now have scope to set more ambitious targets for 2019 to reduce the lead time further. And we think there's scope also to further reduce overtreatment of patients who perhaps don't have the disease. In terms of the morale, that informal feedback helped us to identify ways that we could improve the process in terms of the handling of referrals, the increased workload and the increased complexity, and we have plans in place for that. And in summary, what have we learned? Well, we added a faster non-invasive ultrasound test, we reduced wasted time, we reduced wasted money, and it helped us see more patients going through the pathway. And actually, the process of doing this as an improvement project has been very powerful because we've been able to see the improvement on a run chart. And this has helped us all to motivate us all to improve further and not be satisfied with where we are right now, but actually look for further improvements as time goes on. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. That's really interesting. Have you done Lean for Leaders?
No.
Well, it's well, what's fabulous to see is that you've used the tools and techniques and the method, and you've learnt that, I don't know, from your colleagues or just in your spare time. Well done, Jimmy, and the KPO team. But fantastic. I'm sure there'll be questions. So, shall we start with Vicky and eye casualty? Helen, Deb, you're here, and Jenny's here. So I don't know if there's any comments from you as sponsors first of all.
From my perspective, the eye casualty, as we all know, is a difficult area, so the progress that has been made is really positive, particularly with the changes in staff, and just we know how hard it is to embed change, particularly because the ICAS feels to be slightly separate from the actual eye clinic. So he's doing a really good job of focusing on that board with the production board, picking one tile at a time is definitely paying off, I think.
Yeah. And actually, Vicky, you hadn't been here very long, had you? Not only as the senior sister, but not even a previous background in ophthalmology. Yeah. So,
Vicky, I loved the tile at a time. I thought that, eat the elephant in tile at a time. I really liked that. Just tell me more about what you think might be sitting underneath the bit about engagement with the interruptions piece, because I would have thought people would have quickly wanted to share still. Just tell me what you think might be sitting behind people not wanting to use that.
Hard to highlight that they need some help.
Yeah.
I think it's just a culture thing.
Right.
I think some of the doctors have said they prefer to be interrupted, but then I don't think it's been seen from a patient point of view as well.
Yeah.
I think they're worried that if they put and they need help and they're going to get forgotten and they're not going to help, and potentially I think they don't really know what to be doing in that time while they're waiting. I don't know. I think I just need to do a bit more work around that bit.
Yeah. Well done,
Claire.
I suppose my question is the one that you've expressed around doctor changeover, so that wherever we've got improvement work going, we always find that. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about how we could approach that better, whether it was something around standard work or whatever. Any thoughts on that?
So all I do is every day I make a point of going to casualty, and I make a point, have you triaged notes, have you done this, you know about this board, you know about this, and then I'm catching the ones that either haven't seen the emails or haven't been in casualty for a while, so I just literally just go and make sure that the nursing staff that are in casualty, they know when I'm checking that they're doing it, and just repeating myself.
Just wondering whether or not there's something around induction into a department area, maybe we need to think a little bit more.
To be honest, Claire, I don't know, because obviously every department might be slightly different. But have we got any junior doctors in the room? No, but we've got quite a number of senior doctors who were junior doctors. And I don't remember ever having been given this is what you do. So you might have a timetable that says on Monday morning you're here and on Monday afternoon you're there, but never anything about, oh, come to clinic. But nobody ever telling you, this is what we want you to do when you're in clinic. So I think you're spot on when you talk about standard work. And maybe, Vicky, you could be one of the first to start to test what is the standard work for a doctor in training when they come to the ophthalmology, eye casualty. But I don't know if any of the other doctors in the room want to say anything, and whether you have standard work in your areas.
I suppose in A&E we've got some element of standard work in the fact that when junior doctors start at A&E they need to know some sort of approach about how to manage certain conditions and who to refer to. So there is some. I think all A&Es in the country tend to have an induction program with some form of handbook, or usually electronic now, which is an element of standard work. But I think it certainly could be built on about, well, this is what we want you to do when you enter this particular area. This is how we want you to engage with the patients. It's probably not at that level of detail, but there'd be some benefits for that as well.
Yeah, so there's one thing about here's some guidance about how to treat condition A and B, but not about actually when you arrive in clinic, first thing we want you to do is, when you don't know what to do next, the thing we want you to do is. So I think those are things that we could definitely test. And the best thing is to work with those doctors to find out if that helps them. Joe.
Hi Vicky, thank you very much for your presentation. I was just wondering, just on the background of that conversation, there's something about the standard work of the doctors in training, the junior doctors, but there's also something about perhaps that ask comes from the consultant body, because I think that's the strongest influence for those junior doctors. So if they wrote a letter saying, when you come to eye casualty, this is how we'd like you to work, this is how we're going to support you in your development and training, and this is what's in the patient's best interest, so they get the right answer at that time, I think would be a really powerful lever. It's just a suggestion. Just reflecting what we could do as well, Steve, from an MD perspective, as I'm thinking that through in terms of lessons learned, and also in some of our outpatient areas where we've probably got a very similar issue.
And the miracle worker that gets all the consultants to work the same way can get 10 years off early retirement. Andy.
So I think there's definitely a need to focus on this. We've now got RNTs are going to be changing every 4 months. So I know we're faced now with having to do inductions instead of twice a year, 3 times a year. So I think the idea of having a generic system, I think the paddlers are looking quite interesting, way people are using paddlers. We could provide something like that at inductions across a number of our specialties. So the fact you've just raised, I mean, I'm thinking about what we do at our inductions. We're going to go back and asking my colleagues, how do we prepare them for clinic? I'll be in the clinic this afternoon with a trainee, so I'll ask her. So thank you.
Yeah, and I do like the bit that says, can we ask the trainees themselves as well? So if there was something that was sort of co-designed, that would feel really helpful. And then if we can find a consultant who would be prepared to put their name to it, that would be even more powerful.
So no pressure. Okay. How about questions for Sarah and the GCA pathway? Rachel.
Hello. Just a question about, I'm Rachel from the KPO team. How did you find using the tools and things, sort of without that Leeds background? Did you struggle with anything, or?
No, it was really great actually to have a way of structuring the different aspects of what we needed to look at. And it forced us to think separately about because we spent about a month trying to debate what were the most relevant clinical outcomes, and it wasn't until Jimmy came and said, oh, well, you could, what about these 5 things?
Yeah.
And that really helped us structure our thoughts. And then that meant that we weren't wasting our time measuring lots of things which were less important. We just found one important thing or 2 for the clinical outcomes within each domain. And we just focused on those, and that was really helpful.
I think you picked some good ones as well. It's really great to see you can calculate that outcome. It's fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Anybody? Sorry, Andy, you had your...
Sorry, Sarah, I missed the beginning. The ultrasounds, who was performing the ultrasounds? Was it you as clinicians, or did that go on to another group of individuals that had to perform the ultrasounds?
So we're very lucky to have a biomedical research centre, which is where we do a lot of our clinical research, including imaging. We're very fortunate to have 2 research sonographers who had already had training in this technique. So as part of this pilot, we've been using them to do the ultrasounds. But I think we'd be very interested in perhaps training up some more sonographers within radiology so that we can provide it across different sites. Because one of our problems is we can only do it at Chapel Allerton. Of course, most patients are coming through Jimmy's, particularly the eye patients. So if there's some way that we can work with radiology to train some of the sonographers there, I think that would be very, very helpful and help streamline the process further.
Great, thank you.
David, I think you want to
you mentioned the variability of histology on temporal artery.
Yeah.
So what's your sensitivity and specificity on ultrasound, and how have you used those to determine when to back off from stereotherapy?
So the issue with giant cell arteritis is that because of the false negative biopsy problem, this reduced skip lesions, so people that don't know what that means, it means that the inflammation can be patchy in the way it affects the artery. So if you take a biopsy, a sample of the artery, you might miss the inflammation and get a false negative result. So because of that, the gold standard of does the patient actually have disease or not is difficult because we're working with an imperfect reference standard taking biopsy. So there is some uncertainty in interpretation of the research that's been done already. But taking a big picture view of the literature behind it, the ultrasound is a little bit more sensitive and a little bit less specific, probably, than the biopsy. So they offer different things. So ultrasound is best as a first line because you have that higher sensitivity. But then a biopsy is great for confirming the diagnosis because it's more specific. However, I think there's still work to be done on understanding the true sensitivity and specificity of both tests. And there's also work to be done in terms of standardising the reporting of those tests. So we've been very fortunate to work with Rina Chakrabarti in pathology, who's created a much more standardised way of reporting these biopsies, which has actually helped us a lot as well, because it's given us a lot of confidence in those biopsy results.
Jenny. So hello, I'm Jenny, I'm Director of HR and OD. I really loved your presentation. And I really loved that you were able to work with Jimmy to be able to use the tools and that they gave you a helpful framework. I've got a broader question for Lean for Leaders certified people in the room. Would you have felt confident in being able to do that rather than calling on the KPO expertise to have been able to have done that? I'm interested because we're just trying to think about how we pull on the learning and development investment in the organisation. Would you have felt confident to have played out the role that Jimmy played out?
I would have.
Yay! Great. You would have. Brilliant.
I have done Lean for Leaders, but I've got to say it was a little while ago now, so I feel like I need a bit of a refresher from Jimmy.
So maybe we could have done it together. I'm just thinking KPO, next time you're coaching, whether there is the opportunity to involve a certified Lead for Leaders person in the area that you're working, and how do we start getting Lead for Leaders people involved in those coaching areas? Brilliant, great.
Okay, great question. Claire?
So my question really is, I thought that was superb, and what I really liked is that it really influenced the outcomes for our patients in a really tangible way. And I'm just wondering, it's a bit of a reflection really, how do we share this with more clinicians so they can actually see how this can make a difference to their patient, and actually make a difference to their patient group? because it was really, you know, the fact that you've changed that overall clinical pathway for those individuals, and that you've reduced the amount of waiting that those people are having to do, and the anxiety that provokes in those individuals and everything. We really need to think about how we can share that a little bit more. So that people can,
maybe we could chat afterwards.
yeah, I think so.
I agree, Claire, and I think it would be helpful, Sarah, if you were to add perhaps a couple more slides to that presentation that just talked about the use of the tools, where your thinking was before Jimmy came in and helped you with it, and then what that did, because I think then that presentation could be used to really go to other specialties and say, you might want to think about doing it this way.
We have submitted, with Jimmy's help, we have submitted the work as an abstract to the European Rheumatology Conference. We don't know if it's been accepted yet, but hopefully that explained that we used these lean principles and we used KPO to help us identify these domains, and really describing the domains for improvement as being important. So it might maybe spread to other rheumatologists.
Where's that being held?
So that's going to be in Frankfurt.
So Jimmy, I think it's accepted. If it's accepted, you should be on that trip.
Thanks, it's on record.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks both very much. And I don't know how many of these patients come through iCasualty at all? Do any of them?
Quite a few go through at some point. Yeah, quite a few. So maybe 20%.
Where do the biopsies happen?
So the biopsies are, if they come through iCasualty and they're under ophthalmology, the ophthalmology do them, but the majority are done by the vascular surgeons, and that tends to be LGI as a day case. So this is part of the, when we did our pathway mapping, we talked to the people in the vascular bookings admin side of things, and they've been instrumental in helping us streamline the process and making that a bit more efficient.
So if you're a patient, you might end up in Jimmy's iCasualty, Chapel Allerton, LGI, sample all the sites.
Yeah.
And how many patients a week or a month, Sarah?
So before we started to introduce ultrasound, it was the average patients going through the pathway was perhaps 8 to 10 per month. That doesn't include the patients who were initially suspected but then not booked for further investigations, the patients that went all the way through. Since then, there's been an increase, so perhaps it's now an average of sort of 14 to 16 per month. And this has happened in other places where they've introduced temporal artery ultrasound, so it wasn't a surprise. But it's caused an increase in workload for our juniors, so we're working to address that, because that's an important thing to consider when you make any changes. What's the impact on the staff?
Okay, Jimmy.
I just need to reinforce that my contribution is very modest to this fantastic piece of work. It feels like I've got far more credit than I deserve for pointing very, very capable and talented people in the right direction and then letting them do some great work. So for the record as well, that's about as much as I've done. But if I get to go to Frankfurt, that's not.
Okay. Well,
Thanks, David.
That's very honest of you. Thank you very much. So, anybody got any final questions? In which case, I will say thank you both, Vicky and Sarah. And they were both fabulous report outs, and we can really see the progress that you've made. So thank you very much, everybody. Do we have a report out next week, KPO team? We do. Back here next week. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.